Max Blumenthal is a journalist. He is the author of the new book published by Verso, The Management of Savagery, and he is editor of The Gray Zone, which I believe is grayzone.com or thegrayzone.com, excuse me. And he's also back from a 3-country trip, and we've got a lot to talk about and to catch up on. So without further ado, Max Blumenthal, welcome back to the Zero Hour.
Good to be back.
Good to see you. So before we get into your trip, which I definitely want to talk about, and some of your recent writing, which I'd also like to talk about, as we record this on Thursday, the news of the day is that at the behest of Donald Trump, the Israeli government has banned entry to 2 members of the United States Congress, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. Thoughts?
It's a pretty remarkable instance where 41 Democrats, led by Steny Hoyer, went on an all-expenses-paid AIPAC trip, possibly in violation of congressional ethics rule, on a propaganda tour of Israel. You had, what's his name, David Trone from Trone's Beer and Liquors, Wine and Liquors from suburban Maryland here, posing for a photo in front of a mock section of the apartheid wall and a Patriot missile battery, declaring that he was learning about peace-building efforts in Israel. And he tweeted this out happily. And, the Democrats come back all, hepped up on Ziocaine. And then all of a sudden, 2 of their colleagues decide to go on a trip of their own, which will take them to the West Bank, possibly to occupied Hebron, where in the H2 sector, there is a street called Shuhada Street, which is known as a sterile zone by the Israeli military, which means that the Palestinians who live in Hebron are not allowed to enter that street, and all of their stores are closed because it's Jewish settlers only, and these are the most fanatical and violent settlers. I've been to that street. It's really the ultimate kind of microcosm of the entire picture of apartheid. And I think to have Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who's Palestinian, who's basically doing what Trump asked her, demanded she do, which is to go home, right. Going home and being in this area, demanding to be in this street where Palestinians are not allowed to walk, I think that prospect terrified the Israeli propaganda, public relations complex. And Donald Trump, actually, who needed a distraction, who is trying to rile up his white nationalist base, sent out a tweet demanding that Netanyahu ban these 2 from going. And I think, Netanyahu would have been smart to just ignore the whole thing, just let it happen. Whatever, it wouldn't have changed any of the dynamics, which is that, support for Israel is consolidated on the right across the West, and everybody else can say whatever they want, and the U.S. special relationship would not be upset. But instead, he heeded Trump's call, which was actually kind of in the form of a taunt, where Trump said Israel would show weakness by letting them in. And so what happened, I think, really, first of all, it really exposes the contradictions of Zionism, because you have the self-proclaimed Jewish state letting a foreign Gentile leader determine who gets to enter its occupied frontiers. And on the other hand, you have the Make America Great, America First president bowing to a foreign power, siding with a foreign military dictatorship against 2 U.S. lawmakers. And so the contradictions are really clear. The special relationship has caused some very perverse dynamics to come out into the open. And then the second point I would make is that Israel has always depended, first of all, on its direct line to Washington, but especially on bipartisan support in Washington. And the Israel lobby, the last thing they want to do is make Israel a partisan issue. And that's what Donald Trump has done with Sheldon Adelson and these other Likudnik billionaires like Paul Singer and Bernard Marcus, who funded his campaign to the tune of like $40 million behind him, have done. They've really actively sought to make Israel a Republican issue and to use it to drive a wedge into the Democratic Party, because they want to drive a wedge into Jewish supporters of the Democratic Party, specifically Jewish big donors to the Democratic Party, and bring them over to the Republican side. And this will accelerate that process. And so for those who support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, for those who are, in solidarity with Palestine, this is actually a positive development because it is opening more space within the Democratic Party to talk about Palestinian rights, and it's putting figures like Steny Hoyer and Nancy Pelosi, who are completely in the pocket of AIPAC, on the defensive. I would love to hear what they have to say. So far, we haven't heard anything from them, although AIPAC and other Israel lobby groups are out there doing damage control and actually opposing the Trump-Netanyahu move.
So Steny Hoyer, who I believe is the number 2 in the Democratic leadership in the U.S. Congress, has to this point not said anything in defense of 2 of the members of not only his own body, the House of Representatives, but his own party in that body. He has not said anything in defense of their right to travel to a country that gets billions of dollars in U.S. aid.
Haven't heard anything. We've seen Mark Pocan, who's the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, declare that no U.S. lawmaker should visit Israel until this decision is reversed, which I think is a step forward. I think this, aid should be leveraged here if Israel refuses to allow in U.S. lawmakers. We won't hear any of that from Steny Hoyer. We won't hear that from Nancy Pelosi. Elizabeth Warren has spoken up, and she has not called for leveraging aid and referred to Israel as, this flourishing democracy, which I found to be ridiculous in the context of criticizing the decision. But I mean, what we have to see here is the bigger picture, which is that Israel is a military dictatorship that controls the lives of a majority of people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, denying them any basic standard of rights because they're not Jewish. And that is the epitome of apartheid. And this is simply a reflection of an apartheid state that is dependent on its direct line to Washington.
And just so our listeners understand, you wrote an excellent book on the topic of Israel. Two, but one was excellent. No, I didn't mean that.
Yeah, you didn't like the other one.
Yeah. And the second is that the question of it being an apartheid state, to me, is there's no ambiguity there. If once certain streets, highways, as I understand it, through Palestinian land are
Highway 443.
Restricted for Jewish use only.
Restricted for people who have Israeli IDs or Jerusalem residency.
So de facto,
if you have a green Palestinian ID, it's probably not a good idea to drive there. And it's a shortcut through the West Bank from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. So it just shows how the whole land is intertwined and there isn't any separation except for a political separation, and then there are these physical separation barriers which are used to control the Palestinian population.
And then Shuhada Street, which you mentioned earlier. So how does that work? If a Palestinian tries to walk on that street, they'll be arrested?
Yeah, just go on YouTube and look up Shuhada Street and you'll see footage of, there's a girls' school. Basically, it's just a long street through. All right, well, let me break it down. In 1997, as part of the Y Accords during Netanyahu's first term with Bill Clinton, there was an agreement to hand over most of Hebron to the Palestinian Authority, which kind of acts as an occupation subcontractor, and they do the Israeli army's work for them. So they'll arrest Palestinians engaged in resistance activities, who belong to, banned political parties, etc. But Palestinians get to control that part of the city. But then there's this other part of the city with a series of settlements: Tel Rumeida, Avraham Avinu, fanatics. There is a shrine there to Baruch Goldstein, who is an American fanatic who went and murdered something like 29 Palestinian worshipers at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. And so this area became H2, and it is under the control of the Israeli military. But the Israeli military, if you go there, are effectively under the control of these lunatic settlers who speak with a Brooklyn accent. And you walk down this long street, Shuhada Street, and on each side are shuttered Palestinian shops with Jewish stars painted on them by the settlers to mark the fact that these shops have been, we're talking about hundreds of Palestinian shops, have been yeah, it's essentially Judaized in their words. There's a market that's active inside H2 of Palestinian, shopkeepers, and they have a net over the top because the settlers live above in Avraham Avinu live above the market, and they throw and water and like water bottles full of urine and rocks and eggs down onto the shopkeepers, and you'll see these tapestries hanging up with egg stains all over them because this happens on a daily basis, and then rocks all over the net. So you'll see that you can see footage on YouTube of girls being stoned and beaten by settlers on their way to a girls' school because they have to pass through Shuhada Street. And so in order for them to avoid walking on Shuhada Street, the Israeli military has put up gates which lead them through a cemetery, so they basically walk along the side. Hebron is a more important site to the settlers and to the religious nationalist camp in Israel than maybe even Jerusalem. I mean, this is where the Jewish prophets are from. This is where Abraham is from. This is where Sarah's from. There's a well right in that cemetery or near the cemetery where supposedly Abraham and Sarah would bathe, and the settlers go there and, observe their religious practices there every day. And so the Palestinians to them are just this kind of satanic infection, even though they are the indigenous people. And
they stone and attack them based on their appearance. They identify them as Palestinian.
Well, it's obvious who's who.
Right, because they don't dress like settlers and they don't look like settlers. But you were able to travel there unmolested.
Yeah, I mean, I show my U.S. passport, I pass through a military checkpoint, and I walk around. And the settlers have a lot of propaganda up, like they put up, they have murals explaining, we were killed in the 1929 Hebron riots, and this is our community, we're coming back. And they try to appeal to you in certain ways. But, if you talk to, I was talking to a soldier in the street, and the soldiers, they hate being there, but they're soldiers, and they also don't like the Palestinians. And the settlers might even start yelling at you if you interact with them too much. And I've had all kinds of experiences there where a border policeman who, the Israeli border police are more extreme and right-wing than the soldiers who are just enlisted schlubs who come from the cities. And he checked my visa. He wanted to detain me. I had a woman come up to me screaming in a Brooklyn accent, like trying to attack me, and the soldier stood between me and her.
Because they knew you were a reporter?
Yeah, I was carrying a camera.
Oh, okay.
So this is just something that you can go see, but for a U.S. lawmaker to go there, I mean, I don't know why they don't demand to go there, but for a U.S. lawmaker, especially a Palestinian one, it's just Yishai. Let me just say this: Yishai Flesher, who's one of the heads of the Hebron Settlers Council, called Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib on Twitter. He called them enemy combatants. So he's basically calling for them to be killed.
So,
this is like a Dallas situation.
Yeah, it's horrifying, and yet she's willing to go, and should be allowed to go. I have to say, when I first heard about this, my initial reaction, yours is fascinating in terms of Netanyahu taking direction from Trump on this one, but my first reaction was the least surprising thing I've seen the Israeli government do in a long time is deny the basic right of travel and movement to Muslims. I mean, that to me is highly predictable. The dimension of it, that political aspect of it, I hadn't thought of. But I also wanted to get back to, Trump's politicizing of the Israeli relationship, the special relationship as being a Republican issue. I agree he's done a lot in that direction, but then I also think to Netanyahu's address to Congress during the Obama years, which seemed to me to be Netanyahu getting involved in partisan politics, going there against the president's wishes, speaking against the president from before Congress. He had a lot of Democrats go along with it, but he was injecting himself, it seemed to me, in domestic U.S. politics.
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu is driving the relationship for sure through his billionaire cutouts, who I mentioned before, Adelson, Marcus, and Singer. These are the three names you have to know. And they fund a lot of the, major anti-Iran Likudnik voices in the Senate, like Marco Rubio and Tom Cotton. These are the two pet projects of these billionaires. And what Netanyahu's thinking was when he came to Congress at the invitation of John Boehner, basically to denounce and humiliate Obama, is that the dynamics are shifting on multiple levels. The Democrats are going to demand more concessions for him that he can't make to his domestic constituency. He can't cede 1 inch before his domestic constituency or he loses power. And he also believes strongly that Israel should control everything between the river and the sea except these little cantons which have no religious significance and no significance to the Jewish state.
Which seemed to me a little bit like the Bantustans in apartheid South Africa.
And this has been part of the Likud project since Menachem Begin came into power. But anyway, there's also a shifting dynamic within the American Jewish world.
Sure.
Where, Jews are Democrats, younger Jews think more and more like me, and we see Israel as an apartheid state. We see its treatment of Palestinians as an abomination. We're raised on, we went to Hebrew school and we sang civil rights songs in our, shul. Netanyahu hates that stuff and his supporters hate that. And so he is deciding, let me ride herd on the Christian right instead, because there's more of them. And they are now organized into a domestic bloc, the Christian Zionist bloc, through Christians United for Israel and Pastor John Hagee, which was set up by AIPAC, actually, to do precisely what Netanyahu is doing, which is to reorient the Israel relationship, the special relationship along partisan lines with the Republican Party and Middle America as Netanyahu's safety belt in the Bible Belt. And now, that kind of mobilization has really been consolidated. You also see the creation of a parallel lobby to AIPAC, the Israel-American Committee or Israel-American Conference, which was set up with Sheldon Adelson's money. And this is becoming just as powerful a force as AIPAC in Washington, but it's like solidly Likudnik, solidly right-wing. And this is the future. Netanyahu's relationships with leaders will be strong if they're ultra-nationalist figures like Viktor Orban or Trump himself.
And again, we're talking with journalist Max Blumenthal. See, this to me is fascinating, and I do want to get to your trip, but this is so important. The fact that a lot of people are going to hear your description of the Israeli government as a military dictatorship or the idea that it's fascist. A lot of people are going to balk at that. But to me, it's fascinating that the leaders that Netanyahu reaches out to. I've been to Hungary. I saw the rise of Fidesz, which is Viktor Orban's fascist party. I saw the fall of communism in Hungary, and I saw the reemergence of fascism after communism. And it is fascinating to me and telling that the leaders Netanyahu is comfortable with and forms alliances with are openly anti-Semitic.
I would not say they're openly anti-Semitic.
Okay.
I would say they appeal to some, dark undercurrents of anti-Semitism, but Orban, he's called anti-Semitic for his campaign against George Soros. And George Soros, a lot of the propaganda in Hungary against Soros takes on an anti-Semitic tone. But George Soros, this is an anti-communist billionaire who has plowed his money into regime change operations around the world after earning his money through hedge funds and basically gambling on countries' debt. And he runs the Central University in Budapest. It's a very liberal, open environment. I think it's maybe a positive institution in Hungarian life, but he's also, he has a political agenda in Hungary. He's Hungarian. And I figure like that, honestly, I don't know if he's good for the Jews.
Right. Okay.
Just like Sheldon Adelson, in many ways, they're kind of like the embodiment of an anti-Semitic stereotype.
Look, I'll take your admonition.
I'm not siding with Orban.
No. I understand. I'll take your admonition in the sense that it's certainly not anti-Semitic to criticize anybody who happens to be Jewish, although that accusation is tactically deployed many times. as particular in our debate. But I do think that the rise of Fidel, first of all, he's deeply fascistic. I mean, I don't think you would challenge that characterization of Orban. He's
Well, I
really,
mean, to his right, you have Jobbik, and they're gaining a lot of traction in Hungary, and they are, authentically, overtly fascist. And
but Orban has done very serious work dismantling or altering or restricting what we would consider the institutions of democracy. I mean, that's my view. And certainly a lot of the rhetoric that surrounded the rise of his party was very nationalistic. And I wasn't even thinking of Soros.
here's the main thing with Orban as it relates to Netanyahu, as it relates to Sebastian Gorka, a member of the Vitezi Rend, the fascist order that worships Miklos Horthy, who was a Nazi collaborator in the 1940s, who is a Hungarian nationalist himself, who comes out of the same milieu as Orban. First of all, Hungary, post-communist Hungary, was destroyed by the IMF, the United States, and Western Europe. And everybody lost their pensions, they lost everything, and they became infected with this nativist virus like so many other countries. Then the US wages a dirty war with those same countries on Syria, and millions of Syrians, hundreds of thousands of Syrians, about 1 million, start walking the Balkan route through Europe, heading towards Hungary. And you've got this entire population whipped up on nativism and racism and xenophobia. And Orban says, I'm building a wall. Actually, one of Sebastian Gorka's dissertation reviewers proposed putting pigs' heads on stakes at the Hungarian border to deter the Syrian asylum seekers who had been forced from their homes. Of course, no one looks at the root cause of why there's this migration crisis. But Orban keeps them out of the country. And the country's public sector had basically been ruined by the IMF and all of these international financial institutions. So how can they take care of all these people anyway? There was a real grievance there. And who's the master of keeping out the barbarian Muslim hordes? Which country is really the Fort Apache on the front lines of defending quote unquote white civilization? Which country was described by its ideological godfather as a rampart of civilization against barbarism? I'm referring to Theodore Herzl. It's the state of Israel. So Israel becomes the lodestar for leaders like Orban. That's the country that gets away with that. I mean, what it does, it not only keeps people out, it keeps people in what are essentially open-air prisons like the Gaza Strip, or go to Qalqilia in the West Bank, which is a city surrounded on all sides by the separation wall. And so Netanyahu is the hero for these people. He's the hero for Geert Wilders, the Dutch xenophobe who wants to ban the Quran. Because not only does he do it, he gets $4 billion in aid from the US. And so there's this transatlantic axis that runs from occupied Jerusalem through these rising ultranationalist and nationalist governments in Europe, and extends to Pennsylvania Ave, where Donald Trump has kind of absorbed a lot of these politics and translated it into an American rhetoric for his Middle American and Rust Belt base, who are experiencing some of the same economic changes and are unable to and unwilling to look at why that's happened and instead look for an easy scapegoat. So I think this is actually the future of Western politics.
So, well, it's a grim future, but to me, a very
grim.
Possible one. And I don't want to talk anymore about Hungary, although I could, because
You could close it out.
Yeah. I think that the natural segue when we're talking about migrants coming into a country or resisting migrants coming into a country without any thought to the root cause of why they're migrating in the first place is a logical transition to your recent trip to Honduras, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, because we're not. Nobody seems to be reporting on the root causes of some of the migration into this country, or the future migration we might experience if, for example, we were to successfully destabilize the government of Venezuela. So I would like to talk a little bit about your travels there and what you did there.
Well, each country that I visited, although Nicaragua and Venezuela are 2/3 of John Bolton's troika of tyranny, each country has a kind of different migration situation. Nicaragua, basically because the Sandinista Front won, first of all, it has the lowest levels of violence in Central America. I mean, dramatically lower than Honduras. There are very few incidents of narco traffickers killing each other randomly in the streets. The Maras have basically been kept out. The police forces have been reformed, and they've been carrying out community policing in a very exemplary way for years. And then Nicaragua does not have a migration crisis, although following the coup last year, which was instrumentalized and orchestrated in many ways by U.S. soft power organizations, you did see an outflow of migrants. But it's nowhere near what you're seeing from Honduras, which is really the source of one of the main sources of the migration crisis. You know, this country of like 6 million people, it has one of the highest rates of violent crime in the world. And it's effectively a U.S. colony under the control of this neoliberal U.S. stooge, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who has been accused in a U.S. federal court of engaging in narco trafficking and plowing $1.5 million of cocaine money into his own presidential campaign. And his brother, Tony Orlandez, was arrested in Miami and is on trial for narco trafficking. Juan Orlando Hernandez was just in Washington. You know, after this indictment came out, or this federal court accused him of narco trafficking, he came to Washington, met with the head of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, and then left. Nobody touched him. He's the U.S.'s man.
And how did he come to power again?
Well, he came to power as part of a coup regime that was essentially installed under the watch of Hillary Clinton. There was a coup that
as Secretary of State.
As Secretary of State, there was a coup that that Barack Obama and the Organization of American States objected to, but Hillary personally spearheaded this. Jose Manuel Zelaya was the very popular president who was somewhat of a nationalist, not quite a socialist, and he was participating in the ALBA development program, which was funded by Venezuelan oil money. And small businesses were taking off in Honduras. The economy was doing better than at any time. They're actually building a society. And the U.S. said, no, no, no. You can't get close to Hugo Chavez. We can't allow him to, and Cuba behind him to establish some kind of regional influence. And so Zelaya was kidnapped in the middle of the night by the military, by figures who had just met with U.S. Southern Command, taken on a plane, taken out of the country, and he was replaced with essentially a dictatorship under a rotating cast of neoliberal figureheads, starting with Porfirio Lobo and now Juan Orlando Hernandez. There are massive protests right now in Honduras, which I witnessed while I was there, being violently repressed by U.S.-trained police and military police. And we hear so much less about them than we hear about the Hong Kong protesters for obvious geopolitical reasons. These people are inconvenient. They're unworthy victims of American-style neoliberal economics. The Hong Kong protesters, well, they're also actually being victimized by a form of neoliberalism. There are geopolitical pawns, so we have to stand behind them and celebrate them because we want to fragment Hong Kong from China and weaken Chinese influence. I wrote about how what we're seeing in Honduras is so much the product of the Obama administration that it should become an issue for Joseph Biden, who's running for president. Biden personally oversaw a plan to further neoliberalize the Honduran economy after the coup. It was basically called Plan Biden, but he called it the Alliance for Prosperity. And this was known as Biden's billion in Congress. In 2014, after the migration crisis hit the U.S., and you were seeing children showing up in cages, which the media didn't talk about like they talk about them now because they're Trump's cages and not Obama's gilded nice guy cages. Obama went to Congress for $3.7 billion to basically send the kids back. And Biden managed to slip in $750 million to $1 billion for a plan that was to be overseen by the Inter-American Development Bank, that would be a boon to the energy industry, to the prison industry, and would militarize Honduran society in the same way that Biden helped militarize Colombian society. Biden's running around bragging that he was an architect of Plan Colombia, which was this brutal counterinsurgency plan that saw large swaths of Colombia sprayed with chemicals.
And what years was this?
This began in 1999, and it essentially continues to the present, but it was mostly overseen by Alvaro Uribe, who was this right-wing figure, right-wing president in Colombia, who in 1991 actually showed up on a DEA list of the top 100 narco traffickers because he was so tight with Pablo Escobar. But what they did was spray coca fields. They were massacring not only FARC guerrillas, but there were false flag incidents like the notorious false positive scandal where 22 rural laborers were lured by the Colombian military to a far-off location, slaughtered, and then dressed up in FARC uniforms, the uniforms of the leftist guerrillas. And this was done in order to justify the money that Biden and his crew in Washington was sending to Colombia through Plan Colombia. So this Biden's plan in Colombia, which he said he was an architect of, was the fuel for not just that massacre, but possibly the deaths of 10,000 people, innocent people, maybe more. Last year, Colombia experienced a record coca production. Migration from Colombia is at an all-time high. Cocaine prices in the U.S. I'm not a big purveyor of cocaine, but I think that they are very low and purity is high. So it's basically been a colossal failure. And then Biden went to Honduras and implemented this neoliberalization plan under the Inter-American Development Bank's watch, the Alliance for Progress. And part of the plan was to, if you go to the IADB's website, you can look at the plan and it says that we will establish regional infrastructure for electricity, a major continental electricity plan from Mexico to Panama, with Honduras supplying a lot of that electricity. Because Honduras has rivers that can be dammed to provide a lot of energy for hydroelectric plants. So two things happened as a result of this plan. Number one, electricity prices went up in Honduras because they had to privatize the national electricity company so that these hydroelectric companies that come from the outside can, publicly trade their profits on the market. And so Hondurans, average Honduran people who are already struggling in a country with a 66% extreme poverty rate couldn't pay their electricity bills. And this became a factor in migration out of the country when you just can't pay to keep the lights on. The second thing that happened, and I visited two communities that are hard hit by hydroelectric plants, is these plants hire basically mafias, hitmen, thugs, paramilitaries to terrorize environmental activists because they're seeing their rivers that are their lifeblood destroyed. I went to this kind of remote town called Retoca in the dry sector of Honduras. And this town is an indigenous community that depends entirely on this river that runs through their town to irrigate their crops, to get fish. It's part of their culture. And the river is going to go away because there's an Italian-Chilean hydroelectric plant. And so as soon as this community started organizing, masked men with guns started showing up, brutalizing and terrorizing families, kidnapping people. This is the legacy of Plan Biden, and I'm sure you've heard of Berta Cáceres, who is
of course we've
world famous environmental.
We had her son on the program,
and so this is another part of it.
This is Berta Cáceres, the environmental leader and labor leader who was murdered as part of this lead up to the changeover, as I recall. So unfortunately, we're going to have to draw to a close. But it seems to me, Max, that there is certainly.
Can I, just for 10 seconds,
10 seconds, 15.
Explain.
I'll even give you
okay.
15. Okay.
Berta Cáceres was also resisting a massive energy company, DESA's plans for her community in Tibuca, and she was assassinated as well. all of these companies are fully invested in Plan Biden, and Biden, has this blood on his hands.
Well, okay, good. I'm glad you added that. And I also think that, while these plans may be Biden's plans, these particular ones, the pattern is so often repeated and so old, and it
Well, it goes well beyond Biden.
Oh, sure. I mean, it has, even in Southeast Asia, Alfred McCoy's book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. I mean, this sort of nexus of drug trafficking, large corporations, death squads, overthrows of governments with U.S. assistance. This has been going on for a long time. And we have 30 seconds if you want to have a closing thought about that.
My closing thought is that, there's only one candidate who's talking about that in any way. Maybe could talk about it in a sharper way. It's Tulsi Gabbard, and she is, of course, the one who's being the most mercilessly attacked and denied oxygen to even explain herself. And I think that's really telling. This is where Biden should be confronted and challenged, not necessarily just on his apparent senility and his gaffe, but what he actually represents, because he represents a much wider program that is an existential threat to humanity.
Well, and there is no organized left when it comes to foreign policy and military policy, it seems to me. So that may be one of the reasons. And the media, as always, is cooperating in the suppression of these issues.
Jim Sciutto from CNN yesterday told me that if I want to criticize U.S. foreign policy, I should go to Russia or China. Russia and or China, as if I can move to both at the same time. But that's the mentality that prevails in our media. Critical thinking is forbidden. Anti-war voices are absent, and jingoist, men's warehouse models for imperialism like Jim Sciutto occupy the screen. So, corporate media is a much greater threat to any sign of democracy here than any Russian troll farm. And that's why I think, we need shows like yours, and that's what we're doing at the Gray Zone, is we're trying to provide some kind of space to critique U.S. foreign policy with investigative journalism. So, I wrote a piece about Biden and Honduras and Colombia, and it's at the top of the site, thegrayzone.com.
I encourage people to read it. And as always, Max Blumenthal, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.